Welcome to Straight Up. I'm Stella Winston, your hostess. My guest today is Christine Ingram, an educator, and she's here to speak with us about the Middle Passage. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Stella.
Well, please describe to us, what is the Middle Passage?
The Middle Passage is the experiences of captured Africans as they were captured in Africa and brought to the New World, specifically the portion of the trip where they were on the water. That is referred to as the Middle Passage. You may also hear it referred to as the Maafa.
Maafa.
Yes.
So let me get this clear. So that's the moment they set sail to the time that they arrived?
Arrived in their destination in the New World. Okay,
so are you going to give us a description of that process? Will you do that, please?
Yes. First, I should say that this period of time that we'll be talking about, we're really talking about the West African slave trade. Europeans came from Europe, came to Africa, captured Africans and enslaved them and took them to the New World. Now my specific focus will be on the Middle Passage. But let me give you a little background so that our viewers can understand a little better. Slavery, there was always slavery in the world. This is not something new or just from this time period. There were many different forms of slavery.
And what were those forms?
All right, for example, in Roman times, when the Romans would come and conquer other lands, whatever the population was there, they would enslave those people. Okay. They would use them for different functions. A lot of them were used for agriculture. Some were made warriors to defend Rome and whatnot. These slaves had no rights, but they may have had some input into the disposition of their children. There were other forms of slavery where one African kingdom would conquer another, and they would make the people that they conquered, their slaves. Sometimes the people would be their slaves for a set number of years, and sometimes it would be for life. But
were families kept together in that type of slavery?
Yes and no. No, not in the Roman type. They could be and they could not. But what is different about what happened in the Americas is that it was chattel slavery.
Chattel what does that mean?
Chattel means a piece of property. So when someone became a chattel slave, that meant that the slave owner, the property owner, could have any disposition of that property that they chose.
So the slave owner wouldn't see the slaves that they had as property?
Yes, they were their property.
I want to understand the difference.
They were their property, but they were not people, as we may think of them as people. They had no more say in anything that happened to them than a table that you would buy. If you wanted to throw that table away, you could throw it away. If you wanted to keep it up and treat it a certain way, you could. So they were just straight out property.
And you're speaking of the slave under the chattel system.
Under the chattel system.
As opposed to the Roman.
Well, there were other systems. Sometimes people would commit crimes, and they would have to be someone's slave to work off the crime. But what we're talking about is chattel slavery in the Americas.
Okay. So what happened once the slave was captured on the continent of Africa? Ghana? Okay,
let me split up for you first the slave's experience into three parts. There was a period of time, which I call the capture period. What happened to the slaves from the moment of capture until they got to the actual passage point. Then there was the Middle Passage, and then there was another period of time, what happened to the slaves after they got to the Americas.
Okay, so you want to talk about the capture period just for a moment.
So first we have the capture period. The Europeans would come to West Africa. Now at first they would get their slaves from slave dealers, And we do have to keep in mind that these were African peoples. They would purchase slaves from slave dealers. But then as the slave trade went on, they found that they could make more money if they captured their own slaves. So then they had ships that were capable of going up rivers, and they would sail these ships up rivers and capture slaves there. Now, when these people were captured, they would be marched to wherever the Europeans maintained a slave depot. And this would be on the coast of Africa somewhere. And they would keep them there until they got a likely cargo.
And where would they keep them?
They were kept in forts, sometimes referred to as slave castles. And they had to march there. So if a person was captured in an interior region, that would be many, many miles that they would have to march to first be incarcerated in a slave castle and then kept there for a period of time.
And what were the conditions of the castles?
Well, in the slave castles, people suffered greatly. They were dank stone buildings, very often with no ventilation. You would have quite a number of people in one room. So just so our viewers can get a handle on it, you might have 30 people in a room that was the space of a New York living room. And we all know how small New York living rooms are.
So they were crowded,
they were very crowded. They had to stand. They might have to sit down in shifts. As I said, they were airless. They were cold and dank. There were no toilet facilities. They were given very little water, and they were dark. That was part of the seasoning process to keep them in the dark.
Seasoning process, what do you mean by that?
Well, in order to keep these people in chains, I mean, they wanted to get out. Now, there were more of them than there were the slave captain's crew or whoever else worked there. So to keep them there, they would have to break them down. And they would be beaten. They would be given very little food. They would be kept in the dark. If they did meet another person who was from their village or who spoke their language, they would make sure that they split them up so that they could not communicate. And there was just no comfort to be had.
And how long were they kept in the castles?
It could be months. It could be months as the trade went on. Now remember that this was a trade that lasted about 500 years. We're just talking about the West African slave trade. Of course, in other parts of Africa, it had started before that and went on beyond that. For those years in the Atlantic slave trade, as it got more refined, where they found that they could make more money by using certain procedures, they would capture people to order. They might want people from a certain region because they were good at agriculture. So the captives stayed there varying lengths of time. So it could be a few weeks, it could be months.
Okay. So they're in the castle now. They've been seasoned, as you called it. How were they then loaded onto the ships? Because I'm sure they were rebellious. And
yes.
They didn't, even with the seasoning.
Yes.
How was that done? Now we're into the, are we actually into the Middle Passage now?
Now we're getting to the actual passage. The slave ship captains would provision their ships, and this would take time, and they'd say, okay, we're ready to load our cargo. And that's exactly what they would do. They would have the crews load the slaves onto the ships. The people were kept fettered. That means their hands and perhaps their ankles were kept together in the slave castles. But when they were put on the ships, they were put on their backs and sort of bolted to the floor.
And how were they fettered, with iron?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And iron was an expensive commodity and hard to come by, but they were willing to make the sacrifice because they stood to buy iron, because they stood to make more money by indulging in the slave trade. So the slaves, as I said, would be bolted to the floor on their backs. Now, the first people to be loaded would stay in this position much longer than the last ones put on.
And how long would it take to load a whole ship full of slaves?
It could take several days. It could take a few weeks.
And once they were loaded, what was the condition of the ship?
Okay.
Where they were?
Once they were loaded, they would not be let out at all until the ship was way away from the coast. All right. So they, as I said, they were kept probably bolted on their backs, but as the years went on, the slave captains learned that you could pack more people in by putting them on their sides.
So, like cookies in a box?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so here you had these people in the dark on these rough sawn decks. These were not like a polished parquet floor. It was just rough sawn wood. And they would be lying on their backs, so their skin would be rubbing on it. So their skin would be rubbing off, and they bled. Now, you couldn't move, so wherever you lay, that's where you attended to your bodily functions.
So if the person next to me would defecate, urinate, menstruate.
If you defecated, you urinated, you menstruated right where you lay. If there was a baby that was about to be delivered, it was right where you lay.
But if the woman's feet are fettered, how could she deliver a baby?
Well, there were slaves who died because of that, because the child could not get out.
And what about the sanitary conditions? I mean, you just described the sanitary conditions were horrible, but wouldn't they lose a lot of slaves that way?
Yes, and the people who were involved in the trade, they learned to let the slaves up in small groups and let them out to have air and to have sunshine, because they were losing their investment.
Now, I've often heard that the women were sexually abused, raped. What was that situation for women and men?
Yes, this went on. They were captives, and those who had the power could do with them what they wanted. There was a lot of women were violated, and these were often gang rapes, because the crews were often drunk. So, you know, that's what went on there. And when, say, a male slave would try to intercede, he was soundly beaten.
What about a rebellion?
There were rebellions, and there were instances when slaves did get control of the ship. Now, unless you had someone on there who knew how to sail a ship or what direction to go in, they might end up being lost anyway.
What about slaves dying? I'm sure a lot of them died underneath those conditions.
You can imagine, as I said, they just lived on the decks of these ships and they were bolted down. So infection was rampant. You know, people became ill, and there was a lot of vermin. So there were rats and whatever running all over. People died. They were chained next to someone who might be dead. So the crew, if it was rough weather, they weren't going to rush down there to get that body to throw it overboard.
So if I was a slave, I could, in the bottom of, in the belly of the ship, I could very well be next to a dead person.
Yes.
For a long period of time.
Yes.
And on top of that, have the feces, urine, and
yes,
and all the rodents and the rats.
yes, the people suffered greatly. They suffered greatly, and the mortality rate, the number of people who survived the passage, was not good. It was not good. The slave traders learned how to to raise the number of people who were delivered alive. You know, so the first, say, 50 to 60 years that they were doing this, they were losing a lot of slaves.
Now, you said that the captain or the crew would let them up in shifts.
Mm-hmm.
How did they prevent them from, it's jumping overboard? Because I can imagine
people did jump overboard. This was such a terrible, terrible experience that people did all sorts of things to not have to face it. They jumped overboard. They refused to eat. There were slaves who killed their children rather than let them go through this because they knew that they were going someplace that could be even worse.
And I'm sure the word got around that they were leaving far away from where...
You may have heard people talk about the slave castle in Ghana or on Gorée Island where the people, as they got onto the ship, they would look back and see the castle, and that was the last view that they had of Africa.
Is there anything else about the actual sailing that you would want to bring out?
Yes, that the food was terrible. As I said, very often it was infested with bugs and other vermin. There was little water, you know, so a lot of people went insane from thirst.
What about children? How were children handled in those conditions?
Just the same as any other slave. I mean, if there were mothers, parents there, they would try to keep their child with them, but very often they were not allowed to do that by the crew.
Were any of the slaves in positions, or did they take on any jobs with the
yes,
crew?
sometimes to get more food for themselves, there would be a slave who would be like a slave driver over others right there on the ship.
Now, they've sailed. How long was the Middle Passage? How long was this?
All right, now this could take, say, 2.5 to 3 months in good conditions. But conditions were not always good. The people who ran the ships, the slave captains, they learned to leave at a particular time of year that would make them arrive when they would get the best price in a particular area for their cargo. So if they were going to Barbados, they would know, well, this is a good time of year to go to Barbados, to a sugar plantation, to deliver this cargo there. If you were going to Virginia, then you leave at this time. But you have to remember, we're talking about sailing across the Atlantic. And the Atlantic has some strong weather sometimes. So there were hurricanes. But in the other extreme, there's a period of time, I'd say coming off West Africa, where it's called the doldrums, where there would be no wind force. So the ship would just float there, and they wouldn't go anywhere. And eventually they would run out of food, and they would start throwing slaves overboard so that the crew would have enough to eat.
So a lot of the slaves died if they were caught in the doldrums?
Now, there were different entities that ran these slave ships. When you got into the 1700s, this was quite a large enterprise. And you had corporations that chartered these ships and ran them.
What were the countries what were the main countries involved?
Britain, France, Spain, Portugal. There were other countries such as a couple of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, that tried to get into the trade, and they were late getting into it, so they could not compete so well. The Dutch, for a while, were a very strong slave trading power.
And you mentioned certain corporations. What were those corporations?
Yes, I said in later years in the trade, corporations were set up, and it was run just as we run corporations now. So these shipping companies that would build ships for the specific purpose of slave trading, they were the dot-coms of their day.
Okay.
And this was something where people who invested in it could make a lot of money quickly. And people did invest in it, and they made a lot of money.
Did the captains of the ships make a lot of money?
Yes. Yes. You would find that the captain and the first mate made lucrative, but not the crews. Not the crews. You have to remember that the crews were from the lowest echelons of European society. So
I heard that a famous hymn was written by a captain of a slave ship.
yes, I'm sure we've all heard the hymn Amazing Grace. Well, that was written by someone who was a noted captain of a slave ship who had made many voyages, and in the eyes of his peers ran a very good ship. He wrote that hymn, Amazing Grace.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so they've sailed the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
They now
They've
hit
gone through all of this deprivation. Now, when they arrived in Barbados, in Brazil, in Virginia, in Massachusetts, when they arrived there, the slaves had to be offloaded. Now, when they could see that they were approaching land, they would, if they had the food, feed the slaves better. And then when they got to wherever they were going to take them off, they cleaned them up because they wanted to make a good sale.
So how would they cover up all the festering sores and the sickness?
They couldn't. They would just cover up as much as they could. But we are a strong people, and not everyone had festering sores. You know, the ones who survived the passage, it was like a natural selection. You know, the strongest would survive.
So were they unloaded the same way they were loaded?
Yes, they were taken off, and whatever building, whatever they had to keep them, they were still kept fettered together. Now, the buyers would know that a ship was coming in, and as I said, in later years, when it got more refined, they would be waiting, and they may even have contracted for a specific cargo. And they would haggle back and forth about the price. Now, the slaves were sold individually, unless it was an infant. But if you had a child who was more than, say, 4 years old, that was an individual. You know, people nursed their children in those days. So if you had a nursing mother, they would usually, but not always, leave that baby with the mother who was nursing it.
Now, can you compare the way the slaves were sold off in chattel slavery to the way, let's say, slaves were sold in the Roman times? What's the difference?
During the period in the Americas of chattel slavery, families were broken up, very commonly broken up. It would be more likely that they would be broken up if they had managed to arrive on a slave ship with some kin. It was more likely that they would be broken up on the slave block right there. You know, more likely than not.
And is there any record on the slaves' reactions?
Well, of course they were devastated. People went insane. First, you had been captured and left everything that you ever knew. Slaves did become compatriots and friends on slave ships, so you might have had someone who could bolster your spirits during the passage, and now here, once again, you were having that taken away.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here, Christine Ingram. It was very interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, very informative. I wish we had more time. I hope that you view it again.
And I'm going to read this as if it was written ironically, like satirically, like opposite of what you hear. On being brought from Africa to America, 'twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolical dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train.